What's up, party people? This is chapter 8 of The Object of Capital by Louis Althusser. It's titled Marx's Critique. The chapters of The Object of Capital are Chapter 1, Introduction, Chapter 2, Marx and His Discoveries, Chapter 3, The Merits of Classical Economics, Chapter 4, The Errors of Classical Economics, Outline of a Concept of Historical Time, Chapter 5, Marxism is not a Historicism, Chapter 6, The Epistemological Propositions of Capital, Marx and Engels, Chapter 7, The Object of Political Economy. This chapter, Chapter 8, Marx's Critique, Chapter 9, Marx's Immense Theoretical Revolution, and the Appendix on the, quote, ideal average, end quote, and the forms of transition. So, here we go. Chapter 8, Marx's Critique. Louis Althusser, The Object of Capital. Marx rejected both the positive conception of a homogeneous field of given economic phenomena and the ideological anthropology of Homo economicus, which underlies it. Along with this unity, he therefore rejected the very structure of the object of political economy. Let us first see what was the fate of classical anthropology in Marx's work. For this purpose, I shall make a rapid survey of the major regions of the economic, quote, space, consumption, distribution, and production, in order to see what theoretical place it occupied in it by anthropological concepts. Section A, Consumption. We can begin with consumption, which seems a direct concern of anthropology, since consumption involves the concept of human, quote, needs. In the 1857 introduction, Marx showed that economic needs cannot be defined unambiguously by relating economic needs to the, quote, human nature, end quote, of economic subjects. In fact, consumption is double. Consumption does include the individual consumption of the men in a given society, but also productive consumption, which would have to be defined as the consumption which satisfies the needs of production to consecrate the universal use of the concept of need. This kind of consumption includes the, quote, objects, end quote, of production, natural materials or raw materials, the result of labor transforming natural materials, and the instruments of production, tools, machines, etc., necessary for production. A large part of consumption is therefore directly and exclusively the concern of production itself. A whole part of consumption is therefore devoted not to the satisfaction of needs of individuals, but to allowing their simple or extended reproduction of the conditions of production. From this statement, Marx drew two absolutely essential distinctions, both of which are absent from classical political economy: the distinction between constant capital and variable capital, and the distinction between two departments of production: the means of production department, or Department 1, devoted to the reproduction of the conditions of production on a simple or extended basis, and the means of consumption department, or Department 2, devoted to the production of the objects of individual consumption. The proportion between these two departments is given by the structure of production, which intervenes directly to determine the nature and the quantity of a large part of the use values which never enter consumption for need, but only production itself. This discovery plays an essential part in the theory of the realization of value, in the process of capitalist accumulation, and in all the laws that flow from it. This point is the object of an interminable polemic of Marx's against Smith, which Marx returns to several times in volumes 2 and 3, and which is echoed in Lenin's critique of the populist and their teacher, the, quote, romantic, end quote, economist Sismondi. Footnote: although there is no time to do it here, I should like to note that it would be of great interest to study these long critiques of Marx's in order to find out, on the one hand, what distinguishes Marx from Smith in this crucial matter, and on the other, how and where he locates the essential difference, in order to find out how he explains Smith's incredible, quote, oversight, quote, blindness, quote, misconduct, and, quote, forgetfulness, which are at the root of the, quote, absurd dogma, end quote, that dominates all modern economics. And finally, in order to find out why Marx felt the need to begin his critique 4 or 5 times over, as if he had not got to the bottom of it, and we should then discover, among other epistemologically relevant conclusions, that Smith's, quote, enormous oversight, end quote, was directly related to his exclusive consideration of the individual capitalist. His exclusive consideration of the individual capitalist, i.e. of economic subjects considered outside the whole of the ultimate subjects of the global process. In other words, we should discover once again the determinate presence of the anthropological ideology, in the determinate presence of the anthropological ideology's directly effective form. End footnote. However, this distinction does not settle all the questions. It may be true that the, quote, needs, end quote, of production avoid any anthropological determination, but it remains true also that part of the product is consumed by individuals who satisfy their, quote, needs, end quote, with it. But here, too, we find that anthropology's theoretical pretensions have been shattered by Marx's analysis. Not only does Marx define these, quote, needs, end quote, as, quote, historical, end quote, and not as absolute givens, but also and above all recognizes them as, quote, needs, end quote, in their economic function, on condition that they are, quote, effective, end quote. The only needs that play an economic part are those that can be satisfied economically. Those needs are not defined by human nature in general, but by their effectivity, i.e. by the level of the income of the disposal of the individuals concerned, and by the nature of the products available, which are at a given moment the result of the technical capacities of production. The determination of the needs of individuals by the forms of production goes even further. Since production produces not only definite means of consumption, use values, but also their mode of consumption, including even the wish for these products. In other words, individual consumption itself, which interconnects use values and needs in an apparently immediate fashion, and therefore seems to derive directly from an anthropology, but a historicized one, refers us to the technical capacities of production, the level of the forces of production. The level of the forces of production on the one hand, and on the other to the social relations of production. The social relations of production, which fix the distribution of income, the forms of the division into surplus value and wages. This last point leads on to the distribution of men into social classes, which then become the, quote, real, quote, subjects, insofar as that term is applicable, of the production process. The direct relationship between, quote, needs, end quote, thus defined and an anthropological basis, becomes therefore purely mythical, or rather we must invert the order of things and say that the idea of an anthropology, if it is possible at all, must first take into consideration the economic, non-anthropological definition of those, quote, needs, end quote. Those needs are subject to a double structural, i.e. no longer anthropological determination. The determination which divides the products between departments 1 and 2 and assigns to needs their content and meaning, the structure of the relation between the productive forces and the relations of production. This conception therefore rejects classical anthropology's founding role in economics. New section. Section B. Distribution. Since distribution has been revealed as an essential factor in the determination of needs alongside production, let us examine this new category. Distribution, too, has two aspects. It's not only the distribution of income, which refers to the relations of production, but also the distribution of the use values produced by the production process. But we know that these use values include the products of Department 1, or means of production, and the products of Department 2, or means of consumption. The products of Department 2 are exchanged for individuals' incomes, hence are as a function of their incomes, hence as function of the distribution of incomes, hence as function of the first distribution. As for the products of Department 1, the means of production intended for the reproduction of the conditions of production, they are not exchanged for income, but directly between the owners of means of production. This results from the realization diagrams in Volume 2, between the members of the capitalist class who have a monopoly of the means of production. Behind the distribution of use values, therefore, we can trace the outline of a different distribution, the distribution of men into social classes exercising functions in the production process. Quote, in the shallowest conception, distribution appears as the distribution of products, and hence is further removed from and quasi-independent of production. But before distribution can be the distribution of products, it is 1. The distribution of the instruments of production, 2. Which is a further specification of the same relation, the distribution of the members of the society among the different kinds of production, subsumption of the individuals under specific relations of production. The distribution of products is evidently only a result of this distribution, which is comprised within the process of production itself and determines the structure of production, end quote. Grundrisse. In both cases, whether by the distribution of income or by the distribution of means of consumption and means of production, the index of the distribution of the members of society into distinct classes, we are therefore referred to the relations of production and production itself. Our examination of categories, which at first sight seem to demand the theoretical intervention of an anthropology of the Homo economicus, and for this reason might have seemed to make it well-founded, has therefore produced 2 results. 1. The disappearance of anthropology, which has ceased to play its founding role, determination of the economic as such, determination of the, quote, subjects of the economy. The, quote, planar space, end quote, of economic phenomena is no longer doubled by the anthropological space of the existence of human subjects. 2. A necessary reference, implied by the analysis of consumption and distribution, to the site of the true determination of the economic, production. Correlatively, we see this theoretical deepening as a transformation of the field of economic phenomena. Their former, quote, planar space, end quote, has been replaced by a new pattern in which the economic, quote, phenomena, end quote, are thought within the domination of the, quote, relations of production, end quote, which define them. The reader will have recognized one of Marx's basic theses in this second result. It is production that governs consumption and distribution, not the reverse. Marx's whole discovery is often reduced to this basic theory and its consequences. But this, quote, reduction, end quote, runs into one small difficulty. This discovery is as old as the physiocrats, and Ricardo, the economist of, quote, production par excellence, end quote, Marx, gave it its systematic form. In fact, Ricardo proclaimed the primacy of production over distribution and consumption. We must go even further and admit, as Marx does in the 1857 introduction, that Ricardo claimed that distribution constituted the peculiar object of political economy, because he was alluding to the aspect of distribution which concerns the division of the agents of production into social classes. But here too we must apply to Ricardo what Marx said of Ricardo with respect to surplus value. Ricardo gives every outward token of recognizing the reality of surplus value, but Ricardo always speaks of it in the form of profit, rent, and interest, i.e. within other concepts than its own. Similarly, Ricardo gives every outward token of recognizing the existence of the relations of production, but Ricardo always speaks of the relations of production in the form of the distribution of income and products alone, i.e. without producing their concept. When it is only a question of identifying the existence of a reality behind its disguise, it does not matter if the words or words which designated are inadequate concepts. That is what enabled Marx to translate the language of his predecessor in an immediate substitutional reading, and to pronounce the words surplus value, where Ricardo had pronounced the word profit, or the words relations of production, where Ricardo had pronounced the words distribution of income. This is all right so long as there is no need to do more than designate an existence. It is enough to correct a word in order to call the thing by its name. But when it is a matter of the theoretical consequences arising from this disguise, the affair becomes much more grave, since this word then plays the part of a concept whose inadequacy or absence has serious theoretical effects, whether the author in question recognizes them, as Ricardo did the contradictions he ran into, or not. Then one learns that what one had taken for a reality disguised in an inaccurate word, is a disguised second disguise, the theoretical function of a concept disguised in a word. On this condition, variation in terminology may be the real index of a variation in the problematic and the object. However, it is just as if Marx had made his own division of labor. On the one hand, he was content to carry out a substitutional reading of his predecessors. This is a sign of the, quote, generosity, end quote, Engels, which always made Marx calculate his debts unselfishly and in practice treat, quote, producers as, quote, discoverers. But on the other hand, though in different places, Marx revealed that he was as pitiless towards the theoretical consequences drawn by his predecessors in this blindness as he was to the conceptual meaning of the facts which they had produced. When Marx criticized Smith or Ricardo with the utmost severity, because Smith or Ricardo were unable to distinguish between surplus value and surplus value's forms of Marx was in fact making Smith or Ricardo, Marx was in fact attacking them, Smith and Ricardo, because they did not give a concept to the fact that Smith and Ricardo had managed to, quote, produce, end quote. We can clearly see that the mere, quote, omission... Sorry. Where am I? Where the hell am I? We can clearly see that the mere, quote, omission, end quote, of a word is really the absence of a concept, since the presence or absence of a concept is decisive for a whole chain of theoretical consequences. And in return, this illuminates the effects of the absence of a word on the theory, which, quote, contains, end quote, this absence. The absence of a, quote, word, end quote, from it is the presence in it of a different concept. In other words, anyone who thinks he only has to reestablish a, quote, word, end quote, which is absent from Ricardo's discourse, is in danger of deceiving himself as to the conceptual effect of that absence. He is reducing Ricardo's very concept to mere, quote, words. In this crossover of false identifications, the belief that the construction of a concept is no more than the reestablishment of a word, the belief that Ricardo's concepts are mere words, we must look for the reason why Marx could both exalt his predecessors' discoveries when they had often only, quote, produced, end quote, them without, quote, discovering, end quote, them, and criticize them just as sharply for the theoretical consequences, although these consequences have merely been drawn from the, quote, discoveries, end quote. I had to go into this amount of detail in order to situate the meaning of the following judgment of Marx's. Quote, Ricardo, whose concern was to grasp the specific social structure of modern production, who is the economic of production, who's the economy... I think there's a typo here. Quote, Ricardo, whose concern was to grasp the specific social structure of modern production, and who is the economist of production par excellence, declares for precisely that reason that not production, but distribution is the proper study of modern economics, end quote, Marx. Quote, for precisely that reason, end quote, means, quote, ... Ricardo instinctively conceived the forms of distribution as the most specific expression of the relations into which the agents of production of a given society are cast. The most specific expression of the relations into which the agents of production of a given society are cast, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. The, quote, relations into which the agents of production of a given society are cast, end quote, are precisely the relations of production. And when Marx took them into consideration, not in the form of an, quote, instinctive, end quote, feeling, i.e. in the form of the, quote, unknown, end quote, but in the form of a concept and its consequences, it revolutionized the object of classical economics, and with the object the science of political economy as such. Marx's peculiarity, indeed, does not lie in his having claimed or even demonstrated the primacy of production. Ricardo had already done this in his own way, but in his having transformed the concept of production by assigning to the concept of production an object radically different from the object designated by the old concept. New section. Section C. Let me get some water. I don't know if I'm thirsty now, but I will be soon, and, thirsty. It's already too late. You're done for. All right. Was that nice to listen to? I'm sure it was. Production. C. Section C. Production. According to Marx, all production is characterized by two indissociable elements. The labor process, which deals with the transformations man inflicts on natural materials in order to make use values out of those natural materials, and the social relations of production, beneath whose determination this labor process is executed. We shall examine these 2 points in succession: the labor process, A, and the relations of production, B. Subsection A, the labor process. The analysis of the labor process involves the material and technical conditions of production. The material and technical conditions of production. Quote, the labor process, ... is purposeful activity aimed at the production of use values. It is an appropriation of what exists in nature for the requirements of man. It is the universal condition for the metabolic interaction between man and nature, the everlasting nature-imposed condition of human existence, and is therefore independent of every form of that existence, or rather it is common to all forms of society in which human beings live." End quote. Capital Volume 1. This process can be reduced to the combination of simple elements, of which there are 3. Quote, 1. The personal activity of man, or labor strictly speaking. 2. The object on which that labor acts. 3. The means with which it acts. End quote, Volume 1. The labor process therefore implies an expenditure of the labor power of men who, using defined instruments of labor according to adequate technical rules, transform the object of labor, either of a natural material or an already worked material or raw material, into a useful product. This analysis brings out 2 essential features, which we shall examine in succession: the material nature of the conditions of the labor process and the dominant role of the means of production in the labor process. First feature. Every productive expenditure of labor power presupposes material conditions for its performance, which can all be reduced to the existence of nature, either directly or as modified by human activity. When Marx writes that, quote, labor is in the first place a process which takes place between men and nature, and in which man starts, regulates, and controls by his own activity the material exchanges between himself and nature, he opposes himself to nature as a natural force, end quote. He is stating that the transformation of material nature into products, and therefore the labor process as a material mechanism, is dominated by the physical laws of nature and technology. Labor power, too, is included in this mechanism. This determination of the labor process by these material conditions is at its own level a denial of every, quote, humanist, end quote, conception of labor power as pure creativity. As we know, this idealism has not remained in the state of a myth, but has reigned in political economy itself, and from there in the economic utopias of vulgar socialism, e.g. in Proudhon, the People's Bank Project, Gray, quote, labor bonds, end quote, and finally in the Gotha program, whose opening line proclaimed, quote, labor is the source of all wealth and culture, end quote, to which Marx replied, quote, labor is not the source of all wealth. Nature is just as much the source of use values. Surely, use values are what make up material wealth, as labor. Labor is itself only the manifestation of a force of nature, human labor power. This phrase can be found in any children's primer. It is correct insofar as it assumed that labor is performed with the objects and instruments necessary to it. A socialist program, however, cannot allow such bourgeois formulations to silence the conditions which give them the only meaning they possess. ... There is every good reason for the bourgeoisie to ascribe supernatural creative power to labor. There's every good reason for the bourgeoisie to ascribe supernatural creative power to labor. ... End quote. Critique of the Gotha program. End quote. It was this same utopianism that led Smith and all the utopians who followed Smith on this point to leave out of their economic concepts, any formal representation of the necessity for the production of material conditions of the labor process. to leave out of their economic concepts any formal representation of the necessity for the reproduction of the material conditions of the labor process, as essential to the existence of that process, and therefore to abstract from the current materiality of the productive forces, the object and the material instruments of labor implied in every production process. In this respect, Smith's political economy lacks a theory of reproduction, an indispensable element of any theory of production. The same idealism of labor made it possible for Marx in the 1844 manuscripts to call Smith the, quote, Luther of political economy, end quote, because Smith reduced all wealth, all use value to human labor alone, and to seal the theoretical union of Smith and Hegel. The first because he reduced the whole of political economy to the subjectivity of labor. The second because he conceived, quote, labor as the essence of man, end quote. In Capital, Marx breaks with this idealism of labor by thinking the concept of the material conditions of every labor process, and by providing the concept of the economic forms of existence, of these material conditions. In the capitalist mode of production, the decisive distinction between constant capital and variable capital on the one hand, and between the means of production department and the means of consumption department on the other. This simple example enables us to assess the theoretical and practical effects induced in the field of economic analysis itself by merely thinking the concept of its object. Once Marx thought the reality of the material conditions of production as belonging to the concept of production, economically, quote, operational, end quote, concepts emerged in the field of economic analysis. Constant capital, variable capital, means of production department, means of consumption department, which revolutionized its arrangement in nature. The concept of its object is not a para-economic concept, is the concept of the construction of the economic concepts necessary for an understanding of the nature of the economic object itself. The economic concepts of constant capital and variable capital, of the means of production and means of consumption department, are merely the economic determinations, in the field of economic analysis itself, of the concept of the material conditions of the labor process. The concept of the object exists immediately then in the form of directly, quote, operational, end quote, economic concepts. But without the concept of the object, these concepts would not have been produced, and we should have remained in Smith's economic idealism, exposed to all the temptations of ideology. This is a crucial point, for it shows us that to call ourselves Marxists, it is not enough for us to believe that the economy, and in the economy, production govern all other spheres of social existence. It is possible to proclaim this position and yet, at the same time, develop an idealist conception of the economy and of production by declaring that labor constitutes both the, quote, essence of man, end quote, and the essence of political economy. In short, by developing an anthropological ideology of labor, of the, quote, civilization of labor, end quote, etc. Marx's materialism, on the contrary, presupposes a materialist conception of economic production, i.e., among other conditions, a demonstration of the irreducible material conditions of the labor process. This is one of the points where a sentence from one of Marx's letters to Engels, which I have referred to above, is directly applicable. The sentence in which Marx points out that he, quote, attributed much more importance to the category use value, end quote, than did any of his predecessors. This is a stumbling block for all the interpretations of Marxism as a, quote, philosophy of labor, end quote, whether ethical, personalist, or existentialist, especially Sartre's theory of the pratico-inert, since it lacks any concept of the modality of the material conditions of the labor process. Smith had already related the current material conditions of the labor process to past labor. Smith thus dissolved the currency of the material conditions required at a given moment for the existence of the labor process in an infinite regression, and in the non-currency of earlier labors in their memory. Hegel was to resurrect this idea in his theory of, quote, Erinnerung, end quote. Similarly, Sartre dissolves the current material conditions whose structural combination governs all effective labor and every current transformation of a raw material into a useful product in the philosophical memory of an earlier praxis, itself second to another or several other earlier praxes. and so on to the praxis of the original subject. In Smith, who is writing an economic work, this ideal dissipation had important theoretical consequences in the realm of economy itself. In Sartre, it is immediately elevated into an explicit philosophical, quote, truth, end quote. The anthropology of the subject, latent in Smith, takes the open form of a philosophy of freedom in Sartre. Second feature. The same analysis of the labor process reveals the dominant role of the, quote, means of labor, end quote. Quote, the use and construction of instruments of labor is characteristic of the specific human labor process, and Franklin therefore defines man as a, quote, tool-making animal, end quote. Relics of bygone instruments of labor possess the same importance for the investigation of extinct economic formations of society as do fossil bones for the determination of extinct species of animals. It is not what it is made, but how. It is not what is made, but how, and by what instruments of labor that distinguish different economic epochs. Instruments of labor not only supply a standard of the degree of development which human labor has attained, but instruments of labor also indicate the social relations within which men work, end quote. Capital Volume 1. One of the three constitutive elements of the labor process, object of labor, means of labor, labor power, is therefore dominant. The means of labor is this last element which enables us to identify with the labor process identify within the labor process common to every economic epoch, the specific difference which will distinguish between its essential forms. The, quote, means of labor, end quote, determine the typical form of the labor process considered. By establishing the, quote, mode of attack, end quote, on the external nature subject to transformation in economic production, they determine the mode of production, the basic category of Marxist analysis, in economics and history. At the same time, they establish the level of productivity of productive labor. The concept of the pertinent differences observable in a variety of labor processes, the concept which makes possible not only the, quote, periodization, end quote, of history, but, above all, the construction of the concept of history. The concept of the mode of production is thus established, with respect to our present considerations, in the qualitative difference between different means of labor, i.e. in their productivities. Need I point out that there is a direct relationship between the concept of the dominant role of the means of labor and the economically, quote, operational, end quote, concept of productivity? Need I note the fact that classical economics was never able to isolate and identify this concept of productivity, a fact Marx attacked it for, and that its misconception of history was linked to the absence in it of the concept of mode of production. Footnote. For all these questions, barely outlined in this chapter, see Etienne Balibar's paper, especially his important analysis of the concept of productive forces. End footnote. For producing his key concept of the mode of production, Marx was indeed able to express the differential degree of material attack on nature by production, the differential mode of unity existing between, quote, man and nature, end quote, and the degree of variation in that unity, but as well as revealing to us the theoretical significance of taking into consideration the material conditions of production. The concept of the mode of production simultaneously reveals to us another determinate reality, corresponding to the degree of variation in the, quote, man-nature, end quote, unity, the relations of production. Quote, instruments of labor not only supply a standard of the degree of development which human labor has attained, but the instruments of labor also indicate, anzeigen, the social relations within which men work, end quote. Here we discover that the man-nature unity expressed in the degree of variation in that unity is at the same time both the unity of the man-nature relationship and the unity of the social relations in which production takes place. The concept of the mode of production, therefore, contains the concept of the unity of this double unity. Where the hell am I? Subsection B, the relations of production. We have thus arrived at a new condition of the production process, after studying the material conditions of the production process, which express the specific nature of the relations between men and nature. We must now turn to a study of the social conditions of the production process, the social relations of production. These new conditions involve the specific type of relations between the agents of production, which exist as a function of the relation between these agents on the one hand, and the material means of production on the other. This adjustment is crucial. The social relations of production are on no account reducible to mere relations between men, to relations which involve men, and therefore to variations in a universal matrix, to intersubjectivity, recognition, prestige, struggle, master-slave relationship, etc. I'm going to repeat that. This adjustment is crucial. The social relations of production are on no account reducible to mere relations between men, to relations which only involve men, and therefore to variations in a universal matrix, to intersubjectivity, recognition, prestige, struggle, master-slave relationship, etc. I was all in italics, the bit that I repeated. For Marx, the social relations of production do not bring men alone onto the stage, but the agents of the production process and the material conditions of the production process in specific, quote, combinations, end quote. I insist on this point for reasons which are related to Rancière's analysis of certain of Marx's expressions, where, in a terminology still inspired by his early anthropological philosophy, it is tempting to oppose literally relations between men and relations between things. Footnote. See Rancière's paper in this volume. End footnote. But the relations of production necessarily imply relations between men and things, such that the relations between men and men are defined by the precise relations existing between men and the material elements of the production process. How did Marx think these relations? Marx thought these relations as a, quote, distribution or, quote, combination, Verbindung. Discussing the distribution in the 1857 introduction, Marx wrote, quote, in the shallowest conception, distribution appears as the distribution of products, and hence is further removed from and quasi-independent of production. But before distribution can be the distribution of products, distribution is, 1, the distribution of the instruments of production, 2, which is a further specification of the same relation, the distribution of the members of society among the different kinds of production, subsumption of the individuals under specific relations of production. The distribution of products is evidently only a result of this distribution, which is comprised within the process of production itself and determines the structure of production. To examine production while disregarding this internal distribution within it is obviously an empty abstraction, while conversely the distribution of products follows by itself from this distribution, which forms an original moment of production. Production must begin with a certain distribution of the instruments of production. End quote, Grundrisse. This distribution thus consists of a certain attribution of the means of production to the agents of production, and a certain regular proportion fixed between, on the one hand, the means of production, and on the other, the agents of production. Thus, distribution attribution can be formally conceived as the combination, Verbindung, of a certain number of elements which belong either to the means of production or to the agents of production, a combination which occurs according to definite modalities. This is Marx's own expression. Quote, whatever the social forms of production, workers and means of production always remain its factors. But if they are in a state of mutual separation, they are only potentially factors of production. For any production to take place, they must be connected. The particular form and mode, die besondere Art und Weise, in which the connection is effected, is what distinguishes the various economic epochs of the social structure, end quote. Capital Volume 1. In another and probably more important text, Capital Volume 3, on the feudal mode of production, Marx writes, quote, the specific form in which unpaid surplus labor is pumped out of the direct producers determines the relationship of domination and servitude. As this grows directly out of production itself and reacts back onto it in turn as a determinant, on this is based the entire configuration, Gestaltung, of the economic community arising from the actual relations of production, and hence also its specific political form, Gestalt. It is in each case the direct relationship of the owners of the conditions of production to the immediate producers, a relationship whose particular form naturally corresponds always to a certain level of development of the type and manner, Art und Weise, of labor, and hence to its social productive power, in which we find the innermost secret, innerste Geheimnis, the hidden basis, Grundlage, of the entire social edifice, construction, and hence also the political form of the relationship of sovereignty and independence, in short, the specific form of state in each case, end quote. Marx, Capital Volume 3. This text developments reveal behind the two elements hitherto considered, agents of production, means of production, distinctions of quite crucial importance. On the side of the means of production, we find the already familiar distinction between the object of production, e.g. land, which played a determinant part directly in all the modes of production before capitalism, and the instruments of production. On the side of the agents of production, we find, besides the distinction between labor and labor power, an essential distinction between the direct agents, Marx's own expression, whose labor power is set to work in production, and other men whose role in the general process of production is that of owners of the means of production, but who do not feature in it as workers or direct agents, since their labor power is not used in the production process. By combining or interrelating these different elements, labor power, direct workers, masters who are not direct workers, object of production, instruments of production, etc., we shall reach a definition of the different modes of production which have existed and can exist in human history. This operation, interrelating determinate pre-existing elements, might make us think of a combinatory, if the very special specific nature of the relations brought into play in these different combinations did not strictly define and limit its field. To obtain the determinate modes of production, these different elements do have to be combined, but by using specific modes of combination are or Verbindungen, which are only meaningful in the peculiar nature of the result of the combinatory, this result being real production, and which are property, possession, disposition, enjoyment, community, etc. Property, possession, disposition, enjoyment, community, etc. The application of specific relations to the different distributions of the elements present produces a limited number of formations which constitute the relations of production of the defined modes of production. These relations of production determine the connections between different groups of agents of production and the objects and instruments of production, and thereby they simultaneously divide the agents of production into functional groups, each occupying a definite place in the production process. The relations between the agents of production are then the result of the typical relations they maintain with the means of production, object, instruments, and of their distribution into groups defined and localized functionally in their relations with the means of production by the structure of production. I cannot give a theoretical analysis of this concept of, quote, combination, end quote, and of its different forms here. On this point I refer to the reader to Balibar's paper. But it is clear that the theoretical nature of this concept of, quote, combination, end quote, may provide a foundation for the thesis I have already suggested in a critical form. The thesis that Marxism is not a historicism. Since the Marxist concept of history depends on the principle of the variation of the forms of this, quote, combination, end quote, I should just like to insist on the special nature of these relations of production, which are remarkable in two respects. In two respects. In the text I've just quoted, we've seen Marx prove that a certain form of combination of the elements present necessarily implies a certain form of domination and servitude indispensable to the survival of this combination, i.e. a certain political configuration, Gestaltung of society. We can see precisely where the necessity and form of the political, quote, formation, end quote, is founded, at the level of the Verbindungen, which constitute the modes of liaison between the agents of production and the means of production, at the level of the relations of property, possession, disposition, etc. Footnote. On the one important specification, the term, quote, property, end quote, used by Marx can lead to the belief that the relations of production are identical with legal relations, but law is not the relations of production. The relations of production belong to the infrastructure, law to the superstructure. For a critique of like this kind of strict demarcation between infrastructure or base and superstructure, check out the book that's on this channel. It's a very good book, and I feel like it's really underread. It's titled The Violence of Abstraction by Derek Sayers. It's very good. Anyway, back to the text. End footnote. These types of connection, according to the diversification or non-diversification of the agents of production into direct workers and masters, make the existence of a political organization intended to impose and maintain the defined types of connections by means of material force, that of the state, and of moral power, that of ideologies, either necessary class societies or superfluous class societies. Let me repeat that. I think I fucked it up. These types of connection, according to the diversification or non-diversification of the agents of production into direct workers and masters, make the existence of a political organization intended to impose and maintain the defined types of connection by means of material force, that of the state, and of moral power, that of ideologies, either necessary class societies or superfluous classless societies. This shows that certain relations of production presuppose the existence of a legal, political, and ideological superstructure as a condition of their peculiar existence, and why this superstructure is necessarily specific, since it is a function of the specific relations of production that call for it. It also shows that certain other relations of production do not call for a political superstructure, but only for an ideological superstructure, as in classless societies. Finally, it shows that the nature of the relations of production considered not only calls or does not call for a certain form of superstructure, but also establishes a degree of effectivity, the degree of effectivity delegated to a certain level of social totality. Irrespective of all these consequences, we can draw one conclusion at any rate where the relations of production are concerned. They relate to the superstructural forms they call for as so many conditions of their own existence. The relations of production cannot therefore be thought in their concept while abstracting from their specific superstructural conditions of existence. To take only one example, it is quite clear that the analysis of buying and selling of labor power in which capitalist relations of production exist, the separation between the owners of the means of production on the one hand and the wage workers on the other, directly presupposes, for an understanding of its object, a consideration of the formal legal relations which establish the buyer, the capitalist, as much as the seller, the wage worker, as legal subjects, as well as a whole political and ideological superstructure which maintains and contains the economic agents in the distribution of roles, which makes a minority of the exploiters the owners of the means of production, and the majority of the population producers of surplus value. The whole superstructure of the society considered is thus implicit and present in a specific way in the relations of production, i.e. in the fixed structure of the distribution of means of production and economic functions between determinate categories of production agents. Or in other words, if the structure of the relations of production defines the economic as such, a definition of the concept of the relations of production in a determinate mode of production is necessarily reached via the definition of the concept of the totality of the distinct levels of society and the peculiar type of articulation, i.e. affectivity. In no sense is this a formal demand. It is the absolute theoretical condition governing the definition of the economic itself. It is enough to refer to the innumerable problems raised by this definition, where modes of production other than the capitalist one are concerned to realize the decisive importance of this recourse. Marx often says that what is hidden in capitalist society is clearly visible in feudal society or in the primitive community, but precisely in the latter societies we can clearly see that the economic is not directly and clearly visible. Just as these same societies, we can also clearly see that the degree of effectivity of the different levels of the social structure is not clearly visible. Again, I highly recommend the Derek Sayers' The Violence of Abstraction, because he talks about this, about the specificity of, well, maybe this isn't what Althusser is talking about, but Sayers talks about like the specificity of the separation between like an economic sphere and a political sphere is very highly specific to capitalism. So the base superstructure model, if it applies anywhere, may apply to capitalism, but you cannot, for instance, talking about like say like a clan society, directly make a distinction between economy and politics. Anyway, anthropologists and ethnologists, quote, know, end quote, what to confine themselves to when, seeking the economic, they come upon kinship relations, religious institutions, etc. Specialists in medieval history, quote, know, end quote, what to confine themselves to when seeking for the dominant determination of history in the, quote, economy, end quote. They find it in politics or religion. Footnote, see Godelier's article, The Objet et Méthode de l'Anthropologie économique de l'Homme, October 1965, and in Rationality and Irrationality in Economics. And end footnote. I'd really like to read that book. Godelier had a piece in a Werner Bonafelt edited volume. It was good, if I remember correctly. In all these cases, there is no immediate grasp of the economic. End footnote. In all these cases, there is no immediate grasp of the economic. There is no economic, quote, given, any more than there is any immediately, quote, given, end quote, effectivity in any of the levels. Excuse me, I'm gonna move. I think this noise has gotten out of hand. See if I can find a somewhat quieter place. Maybe it's not quieter at all, but we'll see. We'll give it a shot. I just can't justify to myself sitting inside, and it's nice. Yeah, that changed nothing, but bear with me here, huh? So where am I? I ended the footnote. Okay. In all these cases, there is no immediate grasp of the economic. There is no economic, quote, given, any more than there is any immediately, quote, given effectivity in any of the levels. In all these cases, the identification of the economic is achieved by the construction of its concept. In all these cases, the identification of the economic is achieved by the constitution of its concept, which presupposes a definition of the specific existence and articulation of the different levels of the structure of the whole, as they are necessarily implied by the structure of the mode of production considered. To construct the concept of the economic is to define the concept of the economic rigorously at a level, instance, or region of the structure of a mode of production, is therefore to define its particular site, its extension, and its limits within that structure. If we like to return to the old Platonic image, it is to, quote, divide up, end quote, the region of the economic correctly in the whole, according to its peculiar, quote, articulation, without mistaking this articulation. The, quote, division of the, quote, given, or empiricist division always makes the articulation, precisely because it projects onto the, quote, real, end quote, the arbitrary articulations and divisions of its underlying ideology. There is no correct division and therefore no correct articulation, except on condition of possessing and therefore constructing its concept. In other words, in primitive societies it is not possible to regard any fact, any practice, apparently unrelated to the, quote, economy, end quote, such as the practices which are produced by kinship rights or religious rights, or by the relations between groups in, quote, potlatch, end quote, competition, as rigorously economic, without having first constructed the concept of the differentiation of the structure of the social whole into these different practices or levels, without having discovered their peculiar meaning in the structure of the whole, without having identified in the disconcerting diversity of these practices the region of economic practice, its configuration and its modalities. It is probable that the majority of the difficulties of contemporary ethnology and anthropology arise from ethnology and anthropologies approaching the, quote, facts, the, quote, givens, or descriptive ethnography, without taking the theoretical precaution of constructing the concept of their object. This omission commits them to projecting onto reality the categories which define the economic for them in practice, i.e., the categories of the economics of contemporary society, which, to make matters worse, are often themselves empiricist. This is enough to multiply aporia. If we follow Marx here, too, this detour via primitive societies, etc., will only have been necessary in order to see clearly in them what our society hides from us, i.e., in order to see clearly in them that the economic is never clearly visible. The economic is never clearly visible, does not coincide with the, quote, given, end quote, in them any more than in any other reality, political, ideological, etc. This is all the more, quote, obvious, end quote, for the capitalist mode of production, in that we know that the latter is the mode of production in which fetishism affects the economic region par excellence. Despite the massive, quote, obviousness, end quote, of the economic, quote, given, end quote, in the capitalist mode of production, and precisely because of the, quote, massive, end quote, character of the fetishized, quote, obviousness, end quote, the only way to the essence of the economic, is to construct the economic's concept, to reveal the site occupied in the structure of the whole by the region of the economic, therefore to reveal the articulation of this region with other regions, legal, political, and ideological superstructure, and the degree of presence or effectivity of the other regions in the economic region itself. Here, too, this requirement can be faced directly as a positive theoretical requirement. It can also be omitted, and it then reveals itself in peculiar effects, either theoretical, contradictions and thresholds in the explanation, or practical, e.g. difficulties in planning techniques, whether socialist or capitalist. That, very schematically, is the first conclusion we can draw from Marx's determination of the economic by the relations of production. Marx's determination of the economic by the relations of production. The second conclusion is not less important. If the relations of production now appear to us as a regional structure, itself inscribed in the structure of the social totality, we are interested in this because of its structural nature. Here both the mirage of a theoretical anthropology and the mirage of a homogeneous space of given economic phenomena, it dissolves simultaneously. Not only is the economic a structured region occupying its peculiar place in the global structure of the social whole, but even in its own site, in its relative regional autonomy, it functions as a regional structure, and as such determines its elements. Here once again we find the results of the other papers in this book, i.e. the fact that the structure of the relations of production determines the places and functions occupied and adopted by the agents of production, who are never anything more than the occupants of these places, insofar as they are the, quote, bearers, end quote, träger, of these functions. The true, quote, subjects, end quote, in the sense of constitutive subjects of the process, are therefore not these occupants or functionaries, are not, despite all appearances, the, quote, obviousnesses, end quote, of the, quote, given, end quote, of naive anthropology, quote, concrete individuals, end quote, real men, end quote, but the definition and distribution of these places and functions. The definition and distribution of these places and functions. The true subjects are these definers and distributors, the relations of production, and political and ideological social relations. The true subjects are these definers and distributors, the relations of production, and political, ideological, social relations. But since these are, quote, relations, end quote, they cannot be thought within the category subject. And if by chance anyone proposes to reduce these relations of production to relations between men, i.e., quote, human relations, end quote, he is violating Marx's thought. For so long as we apply a truly critical reading to some of his rare ambiguous formulations, Marx shows in the greatest depth the relations of production and political and ideological social relations are irreducible to any anthropological intersubjectivity, since they only combine agents and objects in a specific structure of the distribution of relations, places and functions, occupied and, quote, supported, end quote, by objects and agents of production. It is clear once again, then, how the concept of his object distinguishes Marx radically from Marx's predecessors, and why criticisms of Marx have run wide of the mark. To think the concept of production is to think the concept of the unity of production's conditions, the mode of production. To think the mode of production is to think not only the material conditions, but also the social conditions of production. In each case, it is to produce the concept which governs the definition of the economically, quote, operational, end quote, concepts. I use the word, quote, operational, end quote, deliberately, since it is often used by economists out of the concept of their object. We know which concept in the capitalist mode of production expresses the fact of capitalist relations of production in economic reality itself. The concept of surplus value. The concept of surplus value. The unity of the material and social conditions of capitalist production is expressed by the direct relationship between variable capital and the production of surplus value. The fact that surplus value is not a measurable reality arises from the fact that surplus value is not a thing, but the concept of a relationship, the concept of an existing social structure of production, of an existing visible and measurable, of an existence visible and measurable only in its, quote, effects. Only in its, quote, effects. In the sense we shall soon define. The fact that it only exists in its effect does not mean that it can be grasped completely in any one of its determinate effects. For that, it would have to be completely present in that effect. Whether it is only present there as a structure in its determinate absence, is only present in the totality, in the total movement of its effects, in what Marx calls the, quote, developed totality of its form of existence, end quote. For reasons bound up with its very nature, is a relation of production between the agents of the production process and the means of production, i.e. the very structure that dominates the process in the totality of the process's development and its existence. The object of production, the land, minerals, coal, cotton, the instruments of production, tools, machines, etc., are, quote, things, end quote, or visible, assignable, measurable realities. They are not structures. The relations of production are structures, and the ordinary economist may scrutinize economic, quote, facts, end quote, prices, exchanges, wages, profits, rents, etc., all those, quote, measurable, end quote, facts, as much as he likes, he will no more, quote, see, end quote, any structure at that level than the pre-Newtonian, quote, physicist, end quote, could, quote, see, end quote, the law of attraction in falling bodies, or the pre-Lavoisierian chemist could see, could, quote, see, end quote, oxygen in, quote, dephlogisticated, end quote, air. Naturally, just as bodies were, quote, seen, end quote, to fall before Newton, the, quote, exploitation, end quote, of the majority of men by a minority was, quote, seen, end quote, before Marx. But the concept of the economic, quote, forms, end quote, of that exploitation, the concept of the economic existence of the relations of production, or the domination and determination of the whole sphere of political economy by that structure, did not then have any theoretical existence. Even if Smith and Ricardo did, quote, produce, end quote, in the, quote, fact, end quote, of rent and profit, the, quote, fact, end quote, of surplus value, they remained in the dark, not realizing what they had, quote, produced, end quote, since they could not think it in its concept, nor draw from it its theoretical consequences. They were 100 miles away from being able to think it, since neither they nor the culture of their time had ever imagined that a, quote, fact, end quote, might be the existence of a relation of, quote, combination, end quote, a relation of complexity, consubstantial with the entire mode of production, dominating its present, its crisis, its future, determining as the law of its superstructure the entire economic reality, down to the visible detail of the empirical phenomena, while remaining invisible even in their blinding obviousness. That's the end of Chapter 8 of The Object of Capital by Louis Althusser. Thank you for listening. The next chapter is Chapter 9, Marx's Immense Theoretical Revolution.